Hello and welcome to today's webinar on the Great Migration to New England, Conventicles to Companies to Congregations. My name is Ginevra Morse, Vice President of Education and Programming at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator for today's program. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history and are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Now, giving today's presentation is Robert Charles Anderson, Director of the Great Migration Study Project. Bob was educated as a biochemist and served in the United States Army in electronics intelligence. In 1972, he discovered his early New England ancestry and thereafter devoted his time and energies to genealogical research. In 1983, he received a master's degree in colonial American history from UMass Amherst and was elected a Fellow of the American Society of Genealogists in 1978. He became a contributing editor of the American Genealogist in 1979, associate editor in 1985, and co-editor from 1993 to 2012. He's been an editorial consultant to the Register since 1989, and through his work and leadership in the Great Migration Study Project, he has aimed to create genealogical and biographical sketches for all immigrants who settled New England between 1620 and 1640. His scholarship has led to several published volumes, searchable databases on AmericanAncestors.org, a newsletter, tours, and education programs such as this webinar. Now, during the 1630s, the migration process to New England was evolving from a pre-planned top-down system to a more spontaneous bottom-up organization. Today, we will explore the evolution of how committed Puritans moved from Old England to New England, beginning with clandestine and illegal meetings known as Conventicles, which then gave rise to small groups or companies of families crossing the Atlantic together, and then resulting in the formation of new congregations and communities in the New World. We will look at 5 different case studies illustrating this process, 3 led by ministers and 2 by laymen. At any point during the presentation, feel free to type your question into the panel to the right of your screen. We'll address those at the end. There is no syllabus or handout for this presentation, but you will be able to watch a recording starting tomorrow on our website and YouTube channel. So if you miss something on today's first listen, not to worry, you will be able to rewatch this presentation at a later time. All right, so without further ado, I will turn things over to Bob.
Thank you, Ginevra, and hello to everyone. Looks like we got a good crowd here today. Before I move on to the talk itself, I want to just throw out a comment or two about that picture you're looking at there. That's a 19th century representation of the Pilgrims. At a first glance, I thought it was meant to be the Mayflower, but if you look down toward the bottom at the hatch that the main characters are standing on, it says Speedwell, 1620. And so this is a depiction of the Pilgrims who had been in Leiden for 11 years, having decided to go to the New World. They are here aboard the ship at Delfshaven, headed for Southampton, where they would meet the Mayflower. I think the person on the far right is intended to be Miles Standish. You see he's wearing armor. I suspect the gentleman in the center holding the Bible might be intended for William Brewster. It could be Reverend John Robinson. If they're still dockside, the people who were waving goodbye could have come on board for a while. And I don't see Bradford in there because Bradford was only 30 years old at the time of this picture. The main characters in the center are clearly older than that. And the last thing I would say is that lovely woman on the far left under the rainbow is most assuredly not a Puritan. So Ginevra gave a brief outline of the changing picture of the migration process, which I've called, for simplicity, top-down versus bottom-up. So for the first 13 years of the Great Migration, of the 20-year period of the Great Migration, most of the migration was organized from the top down. That is to say that a relatively wealthy layman or merchant of some sort who wished to be engaged in the colonization process would buy or rent an entire ship, would go out and recruit the people who would come on the voyage, and would provide the provisions for that voyage and whatever provisions they needed to get started once they hit land in the New World. This was the case with the Leiden Pilgrims. They had to make a deal with London merchants to buy the Mayflower, and the London merchants were supposed to provide the provisions, paid for, of course, by the Leiden Pilgrims and so on. It was the Leiden Pilgrims who supplied most of the passengers, but the merchants wished to send along some of their own. The largest amount of migration to New England between 1620 and 1630 was organized by the Dorchester Company in Dorset, in Dorchester, the West Country, led by the Reverend John White, who was minister at Dorchester, who wanted to settle combined fishing and religious communities in the New World. And he and the merchants and ministers associated with him on an even larger scale did pretty much what the Leiden Pilgrims had done. And then when we come to 1630, when the Massachusetts Bay Company has been formed, the Winthrop Fleet was organized by John Winthrop and a number of London merchants and East Anglian gentry on a similar pattern. But things were changing in the early 1630s, and you can see what I've called the bottom-up process overlaps in date somewhat. I consider that to start in 1630, and I'll explain that as we move along here, and ran through the rest of the decade. Now, those of you who are familiar with the Great Migration Study Project will note that the top-down period, those 13 years, correspond with the years of the first set of books, The Great Migration Begins. And although it's more than half the whole period in terms of time, it's barely 10% of the total number of migrants. It was in that later period from 1633 to 1640 that by far the largest number of immigrants arrived. But things had changed. The pressures in England had changed. There was much more pressure on the Puritans to conform, and therefore many more of them willing to leave England for the New World. And the whole manner of it changed because the pressure was dispersed across all of England. It wasn't that they could, or there was always a wealthy merchant or other gentrymen to organize it, and so smaller groups would coalesce spontaneously. It might be a local minister, it might be a local layman, not of the gentle class, but of the next class down, the yeoman class. And I'll wait until later in the talk to explain just what a yeoman meant at that time. But the difference here was that they didn't, a given group like this was much smaller than those of the top-down groups I'd stated above, and it might be only 5 or 6 families, clearly not enough to purchase or to fill a transatlantic sailing ship. But a business grew up, and because there were more passengers, there were more owners of ships in London and in some of the other outports who were willing to make their ship available in London. In fact, for those years from 34 to 40, several ships would be there at the docks London side ready to take on passengers, and when they had their 100 or 150 or 200 passengers, off they'd go. And it might have several of these groups on one ship. And so these people had to pay for their own passage. They weren't renting a whole vessel, and they had to bring along their own provisions. They had to bring along enough to get them across the Atlantic and something to get them started in the New World. Okay, so the subtitle of this talk is Conventicles to Companies to Congregations. So let me tell you what each of those 3 words means, and then we'll get to the 5 examples. So conventicle, the Oxford English Dictionary definition, is a religious meeting or assembly of a private, clandestine, or legal kind, a meeting for the exercise of religion otherwise than as sanctioned by law. Now that picture on the right certainly depicts something that could be called a conventicle, but we had difficulty in organizing this material. Most of the conventicles of the period we're talking about were not held out in a field or in a wooden grove of woods or whatever, as this was. They were mostly held in private houses. Because they were clandestine and illegal, clearly they didn't want to be discovered by the authorities. and that could be better done inside a closed private house. But that looks like a conventicle or some sort of an evangelical thing. It actually looks more like an 18th century sort of thing than 17th, but there it is. So I want to start first by mentioning two sorts of activities that were private and clandestine, but not necessarily illegal. And those were what is called godly households. Godly is a word used at the time for the Puritans. The Puritans didn't call themselves godly, Puritans. The word they used was godly, to distinguish themselves from most of the population that they didn't think was godly, that didn't follow the Bible, didn't follow Scripture. And two examples, which I discuss in my book that's a couple of years old now, Puritan Pedigrees, are John Bruen of Tarvin in Cheshire and Ignatius Jerdan of Exeter, Devon. These were wealthy men who had somehow been converted to godly sort of piety, and they were not satisfied with the Sunday services. They would sit in the services and they would choose a church where there was a minister who gave the types of sermons that they liked, and they would take notes on those sermons. And then Saturday evening, they'd go home and they'd gather the whole family, and they would go over those sermon notes. And they might sing a psalm or two and pray and so on. And so they were a private religious service. And when I say household, this could include not just the wife and the children, but could include any number of in-laws and cousins and so on, and also servants. The problem was, from the viewpoint of the church and the authorities, was when they went beyond that, when they included just ordinary people not connected to the household, but interested in that form of piety. And it's when you went beyond a godly household to a larger or broader type of clandestine meeting that the authorities became upset and began to round up and penalize the people. But John Bruen, I think, really did do that, because once or twice he was accused by the authorities and managed to talk his way out of it. I don't know so much about the details of Ignatius Jerdan's. We will see in a later section here that one of John Bruen's sons came to the New World. And we know from other sources that 3 of Ignatius Jerdan's daughters married men from Exeter, and they were immigrants to Dorchester, Massachusetts in the early 1630s. Okay, conventicles then became companies. And this slide and the next are a quote from Roger Thompson. Roger Thompson is an English historian who has studied the Great Migration. Some of you may be familiar with his books. He wrote one that this quote is from. And then he wrote a set of 3 on the early history of, separately, Watertown, Cambridge, and Charlestown. Wonderful, wonderful books. And it's Roger's work on this idea of companies that has stimulated a lot of my work and that I've developed in the Puritan Pedigrees book. So here's the quote from Roger's book, Mobility and Migration, which is about East Anglian migration, not all of England. It is a truism that 1630s migration to New England was a family enterprise, in stark contrast to the planting of Virginia with its mob of unattached younger men. And I would say there were unattached younger women as well. Returning to Roger's quote, what is less commonly appreciated is the extent to which people in the eastern counties migrated not just in families, but in coalitions of families. They called them companies. These companies were assembled in 3 ways. Some were the clients and neighbors of a gentle immigrant. Some were devoted followers of a Puritan preacher. Most, however, were groups of relatives, often including servants, moving to the New World together or in series. You can see that book is from 1994. So I was already at work. Well, I had met Roger in the late 1980s when I was just getting started on the Great Migration Project. And so I traded ideas with him beginning in the late 1980s. So I knew this was coming. So he defines 3 of them: gentlemen companies, clerical companies, and extended family companies. The gentle companies were generally those from the top-down period. They were the wealthier people. They were the one, and you see that, clients and neighbors. So the gentlemen were the one who were wealthy enough to buy their own ship and organize it. So we're not going to have much to say about those today. We are going to talk about both the preacher or the clerical companies, those led by a minister, and then the extended family companies. But what I discovered in working on the Great Migration Project in general, and then in writing the book Puritan Pedigrees, was that there's another group that's really a variant of these that I think is, in the end, we'll find is the largest portion of the Great Migration. And those are what I'm calling yeoman companies. And again, yeoman is important both as a sociological term and an economic term. It doesn't mean just a farmer. It means it has a broader meaning, or a more precise meaning than that. And so when we get through the examples, I'll come back to this business of yeoman companies as an elaboration of Roger's ideas. So, and then companies became congregations. So when they got to the New World, most of these people who would come in companies would settle as a group in one town. Now, the companies did not generally come all at once. They didn't all get on a ship and come at one time. They might come over a period of 2 or 3 years. A sort of exploratory party might go out early, and maybe the minister and more would fall later, and others would trickle in. And we'll see examples of different ways of that. So don't think that a company was one group that came together once, got on one ship, and came to New England. They could be distributed over a number of years and a number of ships. But they did generally stay together in the sense that if they sat down in one town, they would join, a later group would join the earlier group. We'll see a variant of that with one of the examples, but it generally works. And then because they were coming to the New World for religious reasons, they wanted to have their own church. And what they were doing, of course, was building a new type of church, what eventually became the Congregational Church. It was called the New England Way early on. And so the first people in town were the ones who generally got to start the church. And so there's a continuity then, which is the whole point of this lecture, from the Conventicles that were started in the Old World, brought across in the companies and forming the new congregations. Of course, as New England history progressed, the population reshuffled and people would move up. But I'm talking about now from the period just before the Great Migration to the period just after the Great Migration. I just point to that beautiful image there. That's a memorial stone in the edifice of the current building of the First Church of Boston, which is on Berkeley Street in Boston. The First Church has moved around quite a bit, and you'll see it starts. First house of worship was built in State Street in 1632. Of course, the church had been organized in 1630, so they probably met in a private house for the first couple of years. You can identify that building if you're walking around in downtown Boston. If you're on the bottom side of the old State House, in that little open area where the Boston Massacre occurred. There's a 19th century, what passed for a skyscraper in the 19th century, right on that little square. And if you look up about 10 or 15 feet above your head, you'll see a stone lintel that said this was the first location of the first church. It only lasted there in that spot for the 7 years it moved up to the other side of the old State House, and then it burned, rebuilt, and so on. So let me talk about Boston, Cambridge, and Dedham quickly, just to give you an idea. So the first church in Boston, as I say, was formed in 1630. For the first couple of years, it was the church for both Boston and Charlestown across the Charles River. By 1632, the people in Charlestown had grown. There was probably an early thought that Charlestown would eventually merge as one town with Boston, but it became a separate town. So in 1632, all the Charlestown people separated off and formed their new church. What happened at that time was that the ruling elder, that is the leading lay leader of the church, was Increase Noel, who was the most prominent settler in Charlestown. So he, when the church was split and he stayed with the church that was formed in Charlestown, Boston Church didn't have a ruling elder. And I will talk about the consequences and the implications of that a bit later. But the earliest, leaving aside the Charlestown people who were sort of temporary people there, the earliest people came either from East Anglia, that is, they were people who came with Winthrop, who were from his vicinity in Suffolk and Essex, or there were the group who came from Boston and Lincolnshire, who were the forerunners of a larger Lincolnshire group who would come in 1633 when John Cotton came. So you had two different companies in a sense. You had the Winthrop, the company, which was kind of a gentleman's company / extended family company organized around John Winthrop. And you had the forerunners of the John Cotton Clerical Company, were the two principal founders of the first church of Boston. And with one of the later examples, we'll talk about a third group that came in and how that affected that. Cambridge was just different. We'll talk about that. Cambridge was settled in 1632-3, and it was originally came from the people who were associated with Thomas Hooker's company, and that at the very first was pretty pure. I think that most of the people who settled Cambridge were from the area that had been where Thomas Hooker had been prominent in preaching in Essex in Old England. And then, that'll be one of the examples we come to later. And then Dedham was different yet. Dedham was a later town. It was formed in 1636. It started as sort of an overflow from Watertown. Watertown had been formed in 1630. And each of these towns they weren't all the 6 mile by 6 mile towns that we see in later New England, but they were about that size. And what they discovered after just a few years on the land was that for agricultural purposes, these towns could only support about 100 to 120 families. So that was fine for Watertown in the first few years, but when the pace of migration ramped up in 1633 and 1634 and 35, Watertown and many of the other towns became overcrowded, and it was very clear that they couldn't support all the new people. So they had to start. It's why you have so many new towns founded between 1635 and the early 1640s. And one of those towns was Dedham, and it began, as I say, as an overflow from Watertown. My own ancestor, John Gay, is one of the first settlers there, and he'd been at Watertown just for a year or so. But it took them, although they formed the town in 1636, it took them till 1638 to form the church. And what happened there was that after the first Watertown people arrived, the migration to New England continued, and more people were coming from everywhere. And in 1637, a large group associated with the Reverend John Allen of Norfolk appeared, and he brought with him dozens of families associated with parishes on either side of the border between Suffolk and Norfolk. And what happened there was very interesting, that there in the process, and it's the best recorded formation of a church. Reverend John Allen kept a very careful log of just all the arguments and the steps that were taken to form the church. And what happened was that John Allen and his group essentially took over the town from the Watertown people. And during that period, the Watertown people essentially trickled away either back to Watertown or elsewhere. And the clerical company attached to John Allen took over the town and formed the church. So the people who formed the town in 1636 and wrote and signed the town covenant had a very little overlap with the people who formed the church and wrote the church covenant 2 years later. So there are different stories for every town in terms of how the migrating companies fill that town and how they form their congregations. Okay, so we've got the three basic concepts in order, so let's start in on the examples. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Reverend John Wilson of Sudbury, Suffolk. He was born at Windsor, Berkshire, about 1591, son of William Windsor, canon of St. George's Chapel. And those of you who watched the funeral ceremonies for Prince Philip a few months back, that's what we saw. That was taking place at St. George's Chapel, which was a royal chapel at the time of John Wilson. It was a wonderful post to have. Before that, William Windsor had been chaplain to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Edmund Grindal, who was a very important Elizabethan Puritan. Grindal died in the late 1580s. Wilson needed a new job. He was already the chaplain, by the way, he may have been, but he was not only the confessor to his superior. He was basically chaplain of a bishop or archbishop, was part of the church bureaucracy. He was the one who handled the paperwork of that diocese. So young John Wilson was born about 1591 at St. George's You know, there's some error there, isn't there? Not son of William Windsor, son of William Wilson. That's a silly error. So thank you, Ginevra. So Wilson was one of the canons at St. George's Chapel. Well, that's right across the river from Eton. And so young John Wilson attended Eton. Eton has an organic relationship with King's College at Cambridge. Most Eton graduates ended up going to King's College, and that's where John Wilson took his BA in 1609, his MA in 1613, and he was a fellow for some years. But he got in trouble. He began to have his Puritan views, and he got in trouble with his superiors and the visiting superior for King's College was the Bishop of Lincoln, and somehow Wilson got in trouble with him. So he left Cambridge in 1613, and for the next 7 years he made an existence as either a chaplain to a gentry Puritan family or giving stray sermons here and there around, mostly again around the Essex-Suffolk border, which was where he ended up. In 1620, he was given he attained a more solid income and a solid position as lecturer at All Saints, Sudbury, one of the 3 parishes in Sudbury, Suffolk, and he was there for a decade. Now, lecturer should not remind you of a lecturer at college. A lecturer was not one of the beneficed ministers. It was not the vicar or the rector or the curate. It was someone who was hired specifically to give sermons. They had no pastoral duties. They simply delivered sermons on theology and church discipline and so on. One of the advantages of that to someone like Wilson, and we'll see it again with Hooker, is that as a chaplain to a private family, or giving the occasional lecture by hire for the parish or the town, or as a lecturer, they did not have to pass certain hurdles with the higher authority. The rector or the vicar, in getting their positions, would have to do something called signing the 3 articles. And I won't go into details on that. I spend some time on it in Puritan pedigrees, but the point is that Puritans were unwilling to sign the 3 articles, and specifically they were unwilling to go along with the part that said that all services would be done in accord with the Book of Common Prayer, that Puritans couldn't put up with that. So someone like Wilson, someone like Hooker would find a way to get through life, to support themselves, to promote their Puritan ideas without having to jump that particular hurdle. And that's what Wilson did for the 17 years after he left Cambridge, and specifically for the 10 years at Sudbury. And I can't prove to you that he organized a conventicle at Sudbury, but I think he did, because he brought, when he came to New England, he brought a whole bunch of people with him. He had his own clerical company. But after he left England, a woman named Alice Blower, whom we'll meet in a while here, did run conventicles, and she was hauled before the Court of High Commission, the highest ecclesiastical court, for running a conventicle, which she should not have done, and especially as a woman, she should not have done. And I think that conventicle that Alice Blower ran was a continuation of one that John Wilson would have run. So let's look at the people who came with John Wilson. This is a page from Puritan Pedigrees. So here's a basic clerical company. John Wilson and 6 people came with him in the Winthrop fleet, and then others came a few years later, you see, as the later arrivals. And notice it's 12 families. That's about an ordinary size. There are bigger clerical companies and there are bigger yeoman's companies, but that's a good size. Just to do some quick arithmetic, 12 families. There were 5,700 families in the Great Migration. So that's 400 or so companies of that size to make up the whole thing. Now, of course, not everyone who came on the Great Migration was religious. Probably 10% or 15% were the fishermen and others who were not interested in Puritan life. But still, we're probably talking of close to 400 companies if they're all of this size. There were 100 ministers who came in the Great Migration, and not all of them had companies associated with them. So if the Great Migration was entirely organized by company, then they could not all have been clerical companies. And that's part of my argument that we need to be looking or the bulk of them, amongst the yeoman leaders and not the clerical leaders. So let's then match this list of people in the company with the more extended chart here. And I'm sorry, I know that's difficult to read. This is a 3-page fold-out in the book, and so I don't expect you to read it. But I just would, if you can somehow read it. In the center there, you'll see at the top George Ruggles and Thomas Blower. Next line down, you'll see under Thomas Blower, you'll see Thomas Blower and his wife Alice, and Alice is the one that I think that led the Conventicles. After John Wilson left, she came across in 1634 with her son Richard Brackett, son-in-law Richard Brackett that you see just below. Richard Brackett had come in 1632. He went back to England, married Alice Blower, and got Alice Frost out of prison, in fact. But you see the other names on there, Ruggles, Brackett, and so on. That's the central group of the clerical company, and also you can see that there are many, many genealogical connections. The right wing of that chart are the siblings of Alice Frost, one of whom married Edmund Rice, and the other of whom eventually married Philemon Whale, who came later and were early settlers of Sudbury, Massachusetts. So they were part of a migrating company of some sort that came to settle Sudbury, Mass, but they have this genealogical relationship with the Wilson Migrating Company. And then on the left wing are other peoples that are genealogically connected and came to New England, but aren't part of any migrating group that I can detect yet. I suspect they were eventually, but the clerical companies had extensions in extended family companies, and as you work out into those extended family companies, you encounter other clerical companies. So I just think that in the long run, if the Great Migration Project completes its work and we dig deeper, we're going to find a gigantic network, one network that either through the genealogical connections or through the religious or social connections of the clerical companies covers a huge percentage of the whole Great Migration. Okay, let's move on to the next example. This is Thomas Oliver of Thorpe, Achurch in Northamptonshire. Born about 1575, resided at the little parish of Lilford for 8 years. He then disappeared from the records for 9 years and then reappeared at Thorpe Achurch, which is immediately to the north of Lilford, where he resided from 1617 to 1632. He was a surgeon. He was one of the most affluent men in Thorpe Achurch, and he moved, as I say, came to Boston in 1632. And one of the interesting things is that soon after his arrival, which was about the time that the Charlestown Church split off from the Boston Church, and we lost Increase Noel as the ruling elder of Boston Church, they appointed Thomas Oliver ruling elder rather than someone from the more long resident Lincolnshire group or Suffolk group. And once we get through the next couple of slides, I'll make a couple more points about that. So the interesting further thing then about Thomas Oliver and Thorpe Achurch was that the minister that was in charge at Thorpe Achurch when Thomas Oliver arrived was a man named Robert Brown. Robert Brown was a much older man, born in about 1550, usual university career, and then he became converted in university and soon after in the 1570s, and became one of the most flagrant of the separatists in the middle of Elizabeth's reign. He would have lost his head had he not been related through a couple of marriages to William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who was Queen Elizabeth's #1 secretary, who essentially ran the bureaucracy of England at the time. And every time Robert Brown would get in trouble, William Cecil would fly in and say, "Oh, no, he's a good man. We won't hang him. We won't burn him." So at any rate, he organized a separatist congregation in 1585. It only lasted in Norwich. It only lasted a few months. He was forced into exile on the continent. His little congregation that he started in Middleburg in the Low Countries immediately splintered into smaller pieces. He went to Scotland for a while, and then eventually he came back to England and ostensibly, outwardly conformed to the Church of England, I think at the urging of William Cecil, who at that time was still alive but toward the end of his life and the end of his career. The upshot was, having reconformed and must have at least outwardly assented to the 3 Articles, was installed as rector at Thorpe Achurch in 1591. So you'll see he's about 40 years old at that point. but he had another 45 years to live. But if you look at the history books in the Oxford Dictionary National Biography, you'll see that the accounts of him and the historians almost always end at 1591 and give you just a few paragraphs more about him. But even though he was ostensibly a conforming minister, he still expressed his moderate views thereafter. And so there arose, therefore, a conflict within the town of Thorpe Achurch, and we don't know just what happened. I spent a lot of time on this. I've spent a lot of time in the church, in the archives at Northampton, looking at the church court records. But at any point, a dispute arose between two factions in the very small town of Thorpe Achurch. It only had about 30 or 40 families, and I think almost all of them were on one side or the other of this thing, and they appear to be two different variants of Puritanism. It wasn't the Puritans against the Catholics or the Puritans against the Orthodox Protestants. It was two brands of Puritanism. And I think it was as much political as religious. At any rate, one faction was led by Robert Brown, the other by Thomas Oliver. And somehow Oliver and his faction ousted Brown for 10 years. He didn't leave town. He lived in a little cottage on the outside of town. But the Oliver faction hired curates to do the work of the church, and they essentially ran the town. But somehow in 1626, Brown flipped the table and he got back into the pulpit and into the post. And he then, as the people, as Oliver and his people would bring their babies for baptism, Brown would enter them in his register, but he would say that they were in schism, that they were schismatics. And in fact, they were actually being baptized next door at Lilford. And although they aren't in the Lilford registers, it's a very odd situation. At any rate, apparently, with Brown getting out of power in 1626, he must have realized soon that he could never get back into the power or practice the type of Puritanism that he wanted. So he made the migration to Boston in 1632. And then he was followed by at least 4 other families from Thorpe Achurch: Edmund Quincy, Thomas Meekins, Elizabeth Woodruff, and Christopher Peake. And this has all been worked out in the last 10 or 15 years by Leslie Mahler and Randy West. Their articles are in the Register and in Tag, all cited there's a whole chapter on this in Puritan pedigrees. And then I'd like to draw your attention to that very nice schematic map there. So the church, the First Church of Boston would be right about where that N in Boston is. You'll see Washington Street there, and the church was on Washington Street near where the old State House is now. So just above that, if you get up north of the N and by the D, and I'm skipping back to John Wilson here just because we have this convenient map. The people who came with John Wilson were all settled in that part of Boston, which is near basically where City Hall Plaza is now. And in the old records, it was called Sudbury End. That is the end of Boston where the Sudbury people had settled. Well, through the vagaries of demography, almost all those families that came with Wilson died out without descendants very soon. So it was only for a few years that Sudbury people lived in that place of Boston, part of Boston called Sudbury End. But those of you familiar with downtown Boston will know that that there's a street there on the north side of City Hall Plaza called Sudbury Street, and that is a 400-year-old recognition of that short settlement by the people of Sudbury. Okay, I can see I've got to move along here, so let's move on to the next example. So Thomas Hooker is one of my favorites. He was from 1625 to 31 lecturer at Chelmsford and schoolmaster at nearby Great Baddow. So he did the same thing Wilson did in getting paying jobs where he could promote his Puritanism that didn't require him to sign the 3 articles. But in 1628, along comes William Laud as Bishop of London. He knows fully well what Hooker's up to and starts harassing him. By the end of 1629, Hooker had been silenced. That is, he'd been prevented from sermonizing. And for the next 2 years, he hid out in various villages around Chelmsford. 1631, he left for the Netherlands, where he was for the next 2 years. And in 1633, he returned just briefly to England and then sailed for New England in 1633. And all this is in an article that I published a few years back in the Essex Journal, a local family history journal in Essex, England. It's hard to come by, but it's I think there's this copy. There should be a copy of the society. I will just point out that that picture down there is of Little Baddow, which for decades was thought to be where Thomas Hooker hung out in those 2 years. But part of my article is to prove that that farm in Little Baddow, and you can see the little blue plaque there that says Thomas Hooker and John Eliot ran a school here. Well, they didn't. And that's unfortunate, but that story was one that was invented in the 1920s, apparently. So anyway, so Cotton Mather in his Magnalia toward the end of the 17th century, talking about this period, says, "Wherefore about this time, 1632, understanding that many of his friends in Essex were upon the wing for a wilderness in America, where they hoped for an opportunity to enjoy and practice the pure worship of Lord Jesus Christ in churches gathered according to his direction, Hooker readily answered their invitation to accompany them in this undertaking." Well, he came to New England in 1633, and his friends in Essex actually came in 1632. So we have, first of all, a passenger list, 22 of June, 1632, and many of those people were settlers in Cambridge. More than half of them, I would say, ended up in Cambridge, some in Roxbury. So these are clearly people from East Anglia. I've highlighted 4 names because just a short time later, in the next record we have, you'll see those same 4 names: Wadsworth, Talcott, Goodwin, and Lewis. So this is from a church court, and you see 4 August 1632. So that's just a short time after, about a month and a half after that passenger list. The ecclesiastical court in Chelmsford is called up I'll jump down to John Talcott on the same. Let the matter stand until his return from New England. William Goodwin, let the matter stand, and so on and so forth. So these people who had already left for New England, the church courts optimistically thought that they would come back to suffer punishment. Of course, they never did. So, and then the last thing then we have in this chronological sequence is a quote from Winthrop's journal. "The Braintree Company, which had begun to sit down at Mount Wollaston by order of court, removed to Newtown. Newtown would become Cambridge. These were Mr. Hooker's company." So a number of quick points here. August 1632. So this entry in Winthrop's journal is precisely when the church court back in England was trying to haul them in. But here they are, assuming that's them in this picture here, kneeling down on Mount Wollaston. Here they are in the New World, and certainly aren't going back to stand up the church courts. And you see Mr. Hooker's company. So company was not just a term that Roger Thompson pulled out of thin air or reworked. That was the term that was used contemporaneously by Winthrop and others. Okay, Edmund Hobart of Hingham, Norfolk, born about 1575, resided at Hingham in Old England, came to New England in 1633 with some other families that you can see. I won't read them all off, they're short for time, but he settled first in Charlestown and then moved to Hingham in 1635. So these other people that came with him in 1633 and a couple in 1634 they came as a group, clearly, so they all show up in 1633, but some of them sat down first in Hingham and some in Charlestown. And that's again part of this process where the towns were filling up. So there wasn't room for all of them in one town, but they knew there were, as you'll see, many more were coming. So they sort of hung out briefly in these towns. And then in 1635, another huge number came. And then in 1638, you can see an entire shipload. This is probably the biggest clerical company we know about. 133 just on the Diligent in 1638, and many before. So this is a huge, huge clerical or yeoman company, because the minister who came along in 1638, Robert Peck, who had been an active Puritan, active nonconformist in Old England, only stayed in New England for 3 years and then went back to Hingham. And the church was taken over by Peter Hobart, who was Edmund Hobart's son. So I think this group needs more study. Someone has to do a full study of Hingham and Old England and the parishes around, and figure out was it Edmund Jacob who organized this, or Robert Peck, or was it a joint thing or whatnot? So again, variants for each of them. And then the last clerical company is Richard Blinman on the Welsh border, younger man. This BA in 1636 was made curate at the little parish of Ubley. That's a beautiful, beautiful church. but he only lasted at Ugly for a year or so, and then he clearly was already of a Puritan persuasion. He spent the next 4 years wandering the Welsh border, and there are scattered records of him preaching in a number of parishes all along there. And then he came to New England in 1640. This was probably the last of the clerical companies, because on 2 March of 1641, these men who must have come the year before propounded for freemanship: Richard Blinman, Hugh Pritchard, Obadiah Bruin, John Sadler, Hugh Calkin, and Walter Tibbet. They only lasted a year or two in Marshfield. They then moved to Gloucester and were there for a number of years, and then some of them moved on to New London. So that's a case where they, I think Richard Blinman built his clerical company during his wandering preaching along the Welsh border, brought them all together, and probably were other families that were not on this list. And then some of them stayed with him for 2 moves in New England. And then I'll point out that Obadiah Bruin there is spelled B-R-E-W-E-N, was the son of John Bruin, B-R-U-E-N, that we encountered way back in the talk of godly households. Okay, so let's sum up where we are here. This is a slide that we created for an earlier England tour when I had just finished the Great Migration Directory and was beginning to form some of these ideas. And this speaks particularly about clerical companies. And so it's a nice 2x2 matrix. Was the minister, did the minister come to New England or not? Did the congregation come to New England or not? So the full clerical company would be someone like Joseph Hull, who had a ministry in Broadway, Somerset, and brought a whole bunch of people with him to New England, and he kept that group together for quite a while. Associated with Joseph Hull were people who came from nearby Batcombe in Somerset. Their minister was Richard Bernard, a much older man. In fact, he'd been associated with the Pilgrims over in Scroobian vicinity. He built up his Puritan conventicle there in Batcombe, but he chose not to migrate. So those people associated themselves with Joseph Hull. So there's one where the minister doesn't come, but some of his parishioners do, as a sort of a phantom clerical company. Lower left corner, Roger Williams certainly came to New England, but he was a loner all his life, and we can't identify anybody who came with him as part of a clerical company. And then you have Arthur Hildesham, who was one of the most prominent of the English Puritans, had connections all through, he knew Bernard, he knew many of the others. There are many, many records in the church court records of him and his parishioners being called up for Puritan activities. Looks like a conventicle to me, but neither he nor any of his people came to New England. Okay, so here's the whole lecture in one picture. Conventicles lead to companies, lead to congregations. Conventicles could be any number of people, but it's certainly the case that not all the members of a conventicle would come to New England. So some of them would come to New England. They would come in companies, but those didn't necessarily come on the same ship or in the same year. But they would try to gather at one place in New England. If they were lucky early, like Hooker, all the people could come to one town. They could form their own congregation and so on. If they were like the Hobart group, when they arrived in New England initially in 1633, there was already not enough room for them. They had to hang out in Watertown and Charlestown for a couple of years to be joined later by others of their members, and built their own town in Hingham. So the last thing is the last paragraph from my Puritan Pedigrees book. Further research on Great Migration immigrants will reveal, I believe, that most of them had long been associated with other Puritans, usually as members of conventicles or some other form of private meeting led by ministers or laymen, that they traveled together to New England in groups, and that at least initially they settled together once in New England, thus allowing them to build the godly society they had wished to create in Old England. So the message I want to leave with you is that when you're doing your genealogical research, and this is becoming more and more common, I'm glad to see, I think it's important to do more than just find the baptisms and burials in the probate records. I think it's important to study the history of the town they came from. If you have the ability and the time to get into the church court records and the other records that lead to this thing, find out not just when your family came, but what were they part of one of these companies? Had they been active as Puritans in the old world? And did they come across with others? I think it it makes a much bigger picture, a much more satisfying picture, and a much greater understanding of what they all went through in the Great Migration. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for that enlightening and expansive presentation. So before we get to everyone's questions, and there are some great ones already in the question panel, I do want to highlight just some of our upcoming programs. It's not too late to register for our online conference on researching 17th century settlers to New England. Registrants have access to 5 pre-recorded class sessions given by leaders in the field, including Robert Charles Anderson. And then this Saturday, we will have a live Q&A session with those instructors. So, you know, and if you're unable to attend the live session or the live broadcast, not to worry, it will be recorded, and registrants will also have access to that and all of the materials until the end of October. Next month, starting on August 11th, we will have a 3-week online course on researching colonial war ancestors in New England. And then on August 19th, we will look at family Bible records from the R. Stanton Avery Special Collections and how they can be an important resource for genealogists. To learn more about these programs and all of our upcoming online events, certainly go to americanancestors.org/education/online-classes. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention our current book sale. So until the end of the month, you can save 20% off all books at shop.americanancestors.org. And that does include all of the Great Migration volumes and works by Robert Charles Anderson, plus thousands of other volumes on a variety of areas and topics within family history. So be sure to check that out. All right, so let's get to some questions. Go ahead and type your question into the question panel, and we'll try to get to as many as we can in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So one question, Nancy asks, how did family groups, and we're talking about kind of the bottom up, so about 1630 to 1640, how did these family groups or conventicles communicate with other groups in order to fill a ship, in order to, you know, for passage across the Atlantic? And is that maybe why we see some of these groups kind of hanging out in port towns and having to wait? How did they communicate?
Okay, I think they clearly did communicate, but I don't think they always did. The first thing I'll say is that by 1634, the people in England had figured out that New England was a going concern. They had a rough year, 31, 32, but things got better. Migration picked up in 1633. And then, of course, when William Laud came in, there was more pressure. And so by 1634, people didn't have to rustle around for ships. There were a number of ship owners and ship captains who realized that they had a good deal in carrying passengers across the Atlantic. And so there are a number of ships, frequently with Puritan captains, believe it or not, that would just be in London by March or April and begin to take on passengers. So they didn't have to communicate to fill up a ship. In other words, by 1634, people all over England knew that there would be ships waiting for them at the docks in London, and that all they had to do was to go to London, and they could sign up and join. So there might be 20 who come from this parish and 20 from that parish. So they didn't have to communicate to fill the ships, but they did communicate. And there was a network, an immense Puritan network. That's part of what the Puritan Pedigrees book does. That certainly through the ministers, many of whom had known one another at university, the ministers communicated. And then if you look at that pedigree chart, that long one that was hard to read, associated with the John Wilson Company, you will see that the genealogical connections spread out across many counties, there's the word I want, counties. So that there was communication all the time, back and forth across the country. And so there was a Puritan network on which all the grapevine that carried all this. But as I say, technically, by 1634, they didn't have to communicate to fill a ship. while I have the floor, I neglected to fulfill my promise to talk about the yeoman companies. Yeoman, technically at that time, there's a wonderful book about the town of Tarling in Suffolk, in Essex. A yeoman was in the historical literature was a man, usually in the country, who owned enough land to provide more than what he and his family needed to live on. So a husbandman was a sort of a subsistence farmer, could just barely keep his family going on the land and assets they had. A yeoman had an excess. That allowed him to trade in the cities, that allowed him to get some luxuries and so on, and to have servants. And I believe it was these people locally who would, I think that's who Edmund Hobart was in that group. I think that's who Thomas Oliver was in his group. I think these are the people that formed the majority of the companies, not the ministers, were the yeomen who were local leaders in the town, not of the next higher level who were county level figures, and had enough resources that they could themselves finance a group of 15 or 20 people, because it cost £5 a head, £5 a head in passage, plus whatever luggage and freight you had. And so if a group of 12 people, husband and wife and children and a couple of brothers and servants and so on, it could cost up to £100 to get them on a ship and across the Atlantic and so on. And not many people could organize it, spend that. So I think that the future of the study of the Great Migration in terms of these migrating companies is going to be identifying some of these yeoman companies at sort of the middle level, not the gentle companies, but not individuals. So I just wanted to stick that in because I forgot to do it in the main lecture.
Yeah, and speaking of the yeoman companies, Carol asks, so why did those yeoman companies come? What were their motivations, and did they differ from some of the other companies that we've been talking about?
So far as I can tell, they were also religious companies, just that they weren't led by a minister. Again, one of the main motivations in writing Puritan pedigrees was to provide additional, there's for a century and more, there's been an argument as to whether the principal motivation behind the Great Migration was economic or religious. And although I believe that economic status and condition could be a secondary or tertiary motivating factor, I still believe, except for that 10% or so of fishermen and others, that 85 to 90% of the Great Migration was religiously motivated, at least at the level of the organizing people. And so, again, the yeoman had the wherewithal to uproot and move across the Atlantic and to take a family and groups with them and others. There's one beautiful, beautiful surviving document regarding Peter Noyes, who ended up in Sudbury, where he that lists the people he brought and the luggage he brought and so on. It's a wonderful document that I think was repeated hundreds and hundreds of times in the Great Migration. So these were people who had been active locally in the Puritan world and decided they would make the migration.
Great. Maggie asks, so did the Puritan families know where they were going when they landed in Winthrop's Boston? So I think kind of some of these later families. And did they have to be invited to move to Roxbury or Dorchester or Charlestown?
I believe the answer to the first part of that is yes, they did know where they were going. Again, there must be thousands and tens of thousands of letters that went back and forth in the 1630s that are now lost. We have dozens that survive. I was lucky enough to uncover a couple of them some years ago when I was working on another project, but I was in the record office in Chelmsford in Essex, looking at a bundle of letters, trying to solve a totally different problem, when I found two letters that Michael Powell, who was a Dedham and then a Boston settler, had sent back to his former master in Romney in Essex in the late 1630s, I guess it was the early 1640s. So there was constant communication back and forth by letter. And you'll see in some of the passenger lists, not many, but you'll see that it says so-and-so bound for Charlestown or bound for Salem or something like that. So they did know where they were going. they sort of needed an invitation. In the earliest days, Winthrop and the other leaders, Dudley and those, tried to control, very minutely control the migration process. In fact, their original idea was to have one settlement. And that was based on what they had with the Winthrop fleet, where there were about 700 people in the Winthrop fleet. That alone would have been a big town. But when hundreds and thousands more came along, it was just impossible to keep them all in one town. And that's why we have that accelerating formation of new towns in the late 1630s and early 1640s. Not so much by invitation, I guess it worked both ways. People could ask to be admitted, and you will see in many of the surviving town records that so on and so on is admitted as an inhabitant. So there was a process, I think it was by reputation. Also, it was by the amount of the size of your estate. How much money did you bring, which could be frequently the state was bringing in cattle and so on. So so there was a process by which people were admitted and so on. And there was kind of a sorting process. This is a big topic that I hadn't intended to get into, but I'll just throw it out there as another way the Great Migration process study can go. Is that once people got to the New World and no longer had the Church of England down their necks, their Puritanism then began, the differences between them and their Puritanism began to emerge that they had suppressed while they were fighting against the Church of England. And so as soon as they landed and started forming the new churches, they suddenly discovered minor theological differences and church government differences. And so that's partly how Rhode Island was formed, of course, and partly how that when Thomas Hooker took people off to Connecticut, he didn't agree with just the way they founded churches in Mass Bay and so on. And this is what Virginia de John Anderson, no relation of mine, in her book, the title of which escapes me at the moment, but it's cited in Puritan pedigrees, called The Great Sorting Out. And so the formation of the colonies in New England and other differences were a working out of minor differences amongst the Puritans once they'd come to New England. So they would settle in a town based on their social connections and genealogical connections, but then as the churches began to develop in different ways, people would resort themselves.
All right. Let's see, a few more questions. These are all fantastic questions, and unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but we can get to a few more. Michael says, if my family settled in Hingham in the mid-1630s, can I assume that they were part of that company that you talked about, or were some settlers separate and not part of that group?
I would say down to 1638, when the big group on the Diligent arrived, and because you say Jacob and the few that came in 1633 moved to Hingham, which was a minor fishing post before that, in 1635 when another group arrived, but that was still a small group. Then in 1638, the much larger group, 130 or so, arrived. So now you've got 150, 200 Hinghamites all in Hingham. I would say at that point, probably yes, but I would presume, I haven't studied it much beyond that in particular, but I would guess that very soon after that, people began wandering in from other places. Fortunately, Daniel Cushing, who was a very young man who came over from Hingham, has left us a record, and he recorded each family as it came and told you where they came from. They weren't all from Hingham and Old Norfolk, but if they weren't, they were from other parishes in that corner of Norfolk. And I recommend, if you're interested in Hingham, that you look at that. It's in volume, it's a very early issue of the Register. It's volume 15 of the Register. You'll find the Daniel Cushing record, which is kind of a pseudo passenger list because he does list everyone who came on the Diligent. So I think the answer is at the very, very first few years, yes, but it would change. Every town began to shuffle almost immediately.
All right. Eileen asks, were all the immigrants who came from Old England to New England in the 1630s Puritans? And if not, what were their motivations if they weren't Puritan?
Okay. Well, that's basically what I said a couple of times during the lecture, that you have about 10 or 15% who were non-Puritan. They were mostly from the West Country, mostly sent out by the fishing interests. They were mostly those who settled along the Piscataqua, farther north in Maine, or in a fishing town like Marblehead. So you had a small fraction who were not Puritans. But it's my contention that aside from those who came for the fishing trade and a few ne'er-do-wells who came, one of the interesting things, and this is one of the differences between the top-down and the bottom-up period, is that in some histories you'll see discussions of people who were clearly not Puritans, who troubled Winthrop and Dudley and the others in those early years. And one of the things that came clear to me as I sorted out that top-down and bottom-up stuff is that almost all those real cranks who were definitely not Puritans and not part of the fishing community came in that period between 1628 and 1633, when the migration rate was low and it was top-down organized. Once you get the bottom-up thing, the more spontaneous thing, it's like the whole process was self-regulated. So there were a smattering of I don't think many Catholics, but a smattering of Orthodox Protestants, Church of England people, and other people who were just troublemakers, but like Thomas Morton, for instance. But it's a small number. And it's one of the goals of the Great Migration Study Project to refine that number more if we possibly can.
Now, this is a little more specific, but several people are actually asking about Reverend John Lothrop,
right,
and how he fits into this scheme, or does he?
Yes, he absolutely does. Okay, I could go on about that at great length. So there were a small number of separatist churches in England. They were totally illegal. When they were tried under Queen Elizabeth, the people were rounded up and dealt with harshly. But there was an underground of people who were beyond separatists. In fact, remember the Pilgrims went, the Mayflower people left England because they couldn't run their separatist churches in 1607 and 1608, and they had to go to the continent. But there continued to be separatist congregations scattered around here and there. They're really under the covers, and but they existed. So there was a man named Henry Jacob, who had been in Leiden briefly at the time the Pilgrims showed up there, and he was there with William Ames and Robert Parker. Robert Parker was the father of Thomas Parker, who became one of the ministers at Newbury. William Ames' widow and children came to Salem. William Ames himself was one of the leading Puritan theorists, if you will, in the early part of the 17th century. Would have come to New England, I'm sure, had he not died, unfortunately, right there in 1634 or 5. Henry Jacob, Robert Parker, and William Ames spent a year in Leiden, just as the Pilgrims arrived, just as the Scrooby congregation arrived, and had conferences with John Robinson and Brewster and others. And it was that group of ministers who elaborated the particular strand of church government that would become the Congregational Church. And so Henry Jacob, after 1611, when he was in Leiden, came back to London and got involved in a church that had been one of these underground churches, but it was called a semi-separatist church. A truly separatist church would not allow the congregants to have any association whatsoever with members of the Church of England. But Henry Jacob had, and to a certain extent John Robinson of the Scrooby Church, had elaborated a middle ground, which is called a semi-separatist church, where you would meet. So there's like an organized, almost public, but not quite conventicle. It would be a group of people who would meet together clandestinely, technically illegally, for church services, but they would still attend Church of England services. So they would have their sermons, have their internal discipline as their semi-separatist church, but they would continue to attend the Church of England. And for instance, so you'll find John Lothrop's children, even while he succeeded Henry Jacob as running this London semi-separatist church. But even while he was there, he had his children baptized in the Church of England church at Eastwell in Kent and in one other parish. So it was kind of a middle ground, but it was a form of Puritanism. It was his group were a very high-level sort of conventicle. So John Lothrop, yes, did lead a clerical company to New England. So he fits fully within the paradigm I've laid out for you.
Great. Maybe two final questions. And the first one is from Todd. He asks, was there resistance from the rulers of England to all of this migration since they were losing their part or perhaps a lot of their population? Or was England kind of just happy to have these people kind of set out and settle these colonies?
I would say it was a mixed bag. First of all, some numbers. Let's see if I can recreate this on the fly. At the time of the Great Migration, the population of England was somewhere in the range of 4 to 5 million. We'll call it 4 million to make the arithmetic work better. In all, 20,000 people, men, women, and children, made the migration between 1620 and 1640. So 4 million divided by 20,000 is 200. So that means that 1 in 200 English men, women, or children made the migration. Now, had things continued on the way they were in 1640, that is to say, had Charles just continued puttering along without Parliament and nothing changed, the Great Migration, I think, would have gone on for some years more. But when Charles called the short Parliament in 1640, Great Migration essentially came to an end, and rather than 2,000 or 3,000 immigrants a year, you had a tenth of that or less. At any rate, so what that means is that 0.5% of the population of England left in those 20 years. Now, it wasn't spread evenly across the country. Puritanism was heavier and denser in the south and east than in the north and west. But it means that at least in the southeast England, everyone probably knew a Great Migration immigrant, not necessarily a close friend, but someone that they knew in their parish or town. But that wasn't a huge drain on the population. Charles and his ministers had other things on their mind than just the Puritans. They were in the midst of the 30 Years' War. They had all sorts of other things going on, so they couldn't always concentrate on the Puritans. They tried to limit the departures. That's why you'll see in the surviving passenger lists, you'll see that the people were required to take an oath of allegiance, but they were also required to say that they were not subsidy men. That means they didn't owe any taxes. So it wasn't specifically a religious reason to keep them back. It was partly an economic reason because that was Charles' #1 thing. Ruling without Parliament, he had to find ways to get revenue. And these taxes that were considered illegal by the Puritans and others were the ways he did it. So there were sporadic attempts by the authorities to prevent, and they certainly tried to prevent a number of the ministers from going. That's why a number of the ministers went incognito. But there was no organized or consistent, sustained effort by the authorities to stop the migration.
All right, and one final question from Marguerite, who asks, has anyone used social network analysis to describe these relationships with graphical interfaces?
Well, I've tried a little bit, but not with a recognized social scientific networking process. It's something I'd love to do. I'd love to find someone who was skilled in that, who was interested. I frankly think we need more data. That's part of the purpose of the Great Migration Study Project. But it's a question, I guess my answer would be, I wish I could. So.
All right. Well, thank you again, Bob, for that fantastic presentation and for spending a few extra minutes answering some additional questions. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. There were so many great ones to choose from, but you may consider working with our research services team if you do need more assistance with your research project, or you can also chat with our genealogist, especially if you are just learning about the Great Migration Study Project and maybe are unsure of what databases there are and what they contain. Certainly our Chat with a Genealogist service is a great option, and it's free, open to the public. It's available Tuesday through Saturday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and you can learn more or use that service by going to americanancestors.org/chat. And I will be including this information as well as a link to the Great Migration Study Project webpage in my follow-up email. So thank you again for joining us. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and others. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. Best of luck in your research, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.